Detecting and remediating security issues is critical, but it's better to build the security in up front. Today, we're talking with a company that helps you do just that. So stay tuned. Hey everybody, this is Chris Brandt here with Sandesh Patel. Welcome to another FUTRtech video podcast. Today we're talking about being proactive about your security. We are talking with Oak9's CEO, Raj Datta, and CTO, Aakash Shah, about building security into your CI/CD pipeline. And if you are in the infrastructure as code world, you know how important it is to get the security right at the beginning. So we are going to talk with this early stage venture-backed Chicago-based company about embedding security into the workflow and aligning it to your compliance strategy. And we're also going to find out what it is like to build a tech company in Chicago outside of the Silicon Valley orbit. Welcome, Raj and Aakash.
Hey, Chris. Hey, Sandesh. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
You know, before we get into what Oak9 is and what you guys do, can you just give me a little bit of the backstory of, how you came up with the idea for Oak9 and, what crazy idea was going through the founders' heads?
So we're three co-founders, Raj, myself, and Om. And Om comes from a development background. I come from a security background. And, one of the challenges that we saw over the last decade as more and more companies were shifting towards the cloud is it was incredibly hard for security teams to keep up with just the speed at which development teams were delivering. And so I lived through those challenges on the security side at a lot of large organizations. And then Om lived through the development challenges as development teams continue to be slowed down by, security reviews. And so, we had been, kind of exploring some ideas in cloud security for some time. And this just seemed like a really interesting problem. And we recognized very quickly that there was a technology solution here that was missing in the market. And, we got Raj a few drinks one day, and just started chatting with him about, hey, what do you think, right? And he started, asking his network, reaching out to folks in his network, and this seemed like a problem that really was resonating with a number of CTOs, CIOs, CISOs, and we decided this is a problem worth solving, and we took the leap, and here we are.
My previous role, before I left IBM, was leading the cloud business for them. And what I saw day in and day out was developers were getting constrained by how fast they could develop because security organizations were slowing them down. And when I started, Om, Aakash, and myself have known each other for over 20 years. And when they heard that I left corporate America and I was hanging out for a little bit, when they approached me about the problem, it immediately resonated with me because this is something that I saw over and over with many of my customers, and this just made total sense at that point.
You talk about something that's really, salient there in terms of like sort of that concept of time to value and how security can kind of be seen as sort of an impediment to that at times. So that's a good jumping off point to start to talk about. So what is it you guys do, with Oak9? Tell me a little bit about how you're solving that problem.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just provide a very high level, right? With the new adoption of cloud technologies, what's happened is there's a new, groundbreaking technology called infrastructure as code. And for those that don't, fully grasp what infrastructure as code is, if you go back 10 years from now or 10 years back and you think about how applications were being deployed, right? Usually you'd have to build a server, you'd have to plug in storage, you'd have to get network cables, etc. I actually started off my career doing a lot of that stuff as a system admin. But as we fast forward to today, all that infrastructure has been codified. And so what happens when something gets codified? Developers take a hold of it and it increases their speed of development. Right. And that's really where we step in, because what we're doing is we're securing all of this infrastructure as code that's going into the cloud, tens of thousands of lines of code that are constantly being written, every minute. We're securing all that code throughout the development lifecycle and ensuring the whole application is compliant and secure by design.
how does that all work? I mean, we're talking about adding security into the development process, into the CI/CD pipeline, continuous integration, continuous development pipeline. And we talk about infrastructure as code. For people who really don't understand what all that is and how that all works, can you kind of explain how things all flow?
As Raj was saying, right? Like what we're seeing today is entire application architectures today are codified use in infrastructure as code languages like Terraform. And in the way, more and more ownership of this code is falling under the umbrella of dev teams, right? And I'll use the term developer very generically here because now we have this new role of an infrastructure developer, someone that is actually developing the infrastructure that the app is running on. And more what you see teams do is they're building automation pipelines that take this code and then automatically provision the infrastructure that the app requires in your dev environment, from your dev, then going into your test environment, to your production environment. And that entire lifecycle is now automated. So to give you an example today, right, our SaaS platform, we can deploy our entire SaaS platform in a new region with just the push of a button, right? And it'll deploy all the environments. It'll progressively, deploy our app across dev, test, and production. And this is all handled through automation, right? So more and more teams are really investing in these CI/CD tools and automation capabilities to automate the provisioning of their infrastructure.
When you're developing an environment, there's a lot of best practices, things that you have to follow, and there's also, companies are faced with a lot of compliance and regulatory challenges as well, right? And so, one of the things that you want to do is both secure your environment, secure your infrastructure, but you also have to make sure that, besides following the best, practices for that, you're following whatever compliance standard you're mapping to, right? Could you talk a little bit about what you do on that front?
When we assess an application architecture that is represented in languages like Terraform, what we are doing is we're assessing them against our security blueprints. And think of our security blueprints as tailored security design that gets created at the point in time that we're validating your application architecture. One of the things that we do in our platform is we ask a handful of questions of the developer to get a better understanding of the business use case that this application is actually solving. So, is this a B2B application? Is this a B2C application? Is it dealing with sensitive data? And among those questions, right, is a question around the compliance and regulatory frameworks that this application is using or this application wants to adhere to. And then what our blueprints do when we tailor security is we take that as input and we say, okay, we understand this application is a healthcare application. It's dealing with patient information. It needs to be HIPAA compliant. It needs to adhere to high trust as a standard. And so what we can then do is we can make sure the right requirements are being applied to this application architecture. And then our platform then decides where these requirements get applied across this application architecture, as well as, the how, right? Like, how do I meet this requirement to make sure that I'm going to be high trust compliant? And then we can give that tailored feedback back to the developer. So as we build these blueprints, we are incorporating all of these major frameworks into our blueprints.
Walk me through a little bit how it all comes together, right? I mean, so I've got to adhere to PCI and HIPAA, and so I set up that as sort of my controls that I want to measure what I'm doing against, right? And then, then what happens? How do you guys insert yourself and how do you apply these security blueprints?
There's a number of different points where we integrate into the development lifecycle. So, we want to seamlessly fit into that developer's workflow so that as they're updating that infrastructure as code, we can immediately assess it and give them fast feedback. So as early as when they're locally developing, we want to integrate into that workflow and give them feedback. As they commit their code into code repositories, we are a step in that pipeline. We have integrations with these code repositories so we can analyze that code, understand what the application architecture is, and then, tailor make that blueprint for that application architecture to assess it. And so then your question around, well, let's say, the developer told us that, hey, this application is going to be dealing with credit card information. And so it needs to be PCI compliant. Well, at that point, what we're doing is when we assess this application architecture, our blueprints under the hood are built using our security as code framework. And very simply, what we're doing is we're dynamically deciding, well, based on the fact that this needs to be PCI compliant, what are the security requirements that apply to this application? Where do they apply across the application architecture? What's the level of rigor at which we need to meet these requirements? And then what's the impact to the business if the requirement is not met? And all of this is something we're doing dynamically. So when the user selects PCI, what internally happens in our blueprints is we have our own control framework that we've built. And we've mapped that to every single industry framework that's out there. And so now what we can do is we can say, okay, I know what it takes to actually adhere to this PCI requirement and meet the requirements of this particular control. Here's what needs to be done for this particular Azure deployment that's happening. And here are the tens, if not hundreds of things that need to happen to meet this requirement.
That's got to be a lot of work because, there's a lot of standards. They are very complex. And there's a lot of detail in some of those. So tell me, you have the security as code blueprints. How does that all work? And if you're talking about having multiple potentially, regulatory and compliance standards that you're working towards, some of them are complementary, but I would imagine there's, potentially even some conflict between some of those, and just a lot of difficult nuance to sort of tease out of that. How does that all work?
One of the things that is common across a lot of these industry frameworks is they're trying to drive, users to best practices from a security standpoint. And so most of these frameworks focus on the what is it that you need to do, but they don't necessarily jump into the how. But every so often, right, you'll see a framework that also is very prescriptive about how a security requirement should be met. And then, you get into these conflicts where, well, it's the same requirement, but the way AWS's best practices are recommending we meet this requirement versus, say, High Trust might have some very prescriptive guidance on something. They can be in conflict, right? And what we're doing is then we're relying on kind of our subject matter expertise to then prioritize to say, hey, this is what we'll recommend to the developer. But we're also then giving that developer the additional choice to say, hey, this is what we recommended. But by the way, there's some additional choices. So, we can then essentially give that developer the freedom to pick the design pattern that they want to follow. And if they don't know, right, they'll go with our default.
So that means that if you have sort of a hybrid control structure, utilizing parts of different compliance standards, for example, you could potentially create your own security blueprints to map to that sort of thing.
When you say hybrid control structure, can you expand on that?
Maybe you're following, you don't need to be PCI compliant, but you're following a certain subset of PCI compliance rules. But on the other hand, PCI isn't necessarily concerned about availability, for example, right? Because if your systems are down, nobody's stealing credit cards, right? So that's great for them. But, you want to be available. So, merging, some things from one thing and another thing and to create your own sort of blueprint like that.
Love that question. As we look, what we've done under the hood is I mentioned we kind of built our own technical security control framework. And that control framework, right, is really comprehensive and covers all of your technical security needs, including things like business resiliency. And then we're mapping this framework to industry standards. And so when, even if PCI isn't focused on business resiliency, what we will do is we will make sure that we're still applying business resiliency requirements. And so we're not limited to the frameworks and what they are recommending. We're still always recommending our best practices. But what the advantage of all of this is that we can pivot this information. So now as a developer, right, when the auditor comes to you and says, hey, show me how you're PCI compliant, right? You literally click of a button, create a report that says, hey, these are all the things I'm doing to satisfy PCI. Next day, maybe it was a healthcare application, right? And so the high trust compliance individual comes to you and says, hey, well, show me how you're complying with high trust. Click of a button, right? Generating that report for high trust, so that real-time information about how this particular application architecture is satisfying the control requirements within these frameworks.
That sounds really handy, because I'll tell you, man, I lived in, like compliance rich environments in the past, and the audits were brutal, both internal and external audits, just never ended. And the amount of systems you had to walk somebody through to, tick a box, and, the amount of compensating controls. And that's, I guess, another one too. I mean, if there's certain aspects of your stuff that would necessarily fall under like a compensating control, I imagine you have a framework, to deal with some of that as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really about, giving the developer choices in terms of the design patterns they want to follow within that application architecture, and really tailor how they meet a given requirement, right? So, I'll give you an example where, let's say you have a web application that's a B2C application, and you still have users using old browsers like IE6, for example.
Right.
We're going to, by default, make recommendations around how TLS settings should be configured, what cipher suites should be set within load balancers. But, if we recommend the latest and greatest cipher suites, it's not going to work on old browsers, and the developer is going to run into issues, right? Because their users won't be able to access their site. So this is a case where really they may want to optimize for compatibility. And so giving them that choice to say, hey, my pattern here for how this load balancer is configured really needs to be focused on compatibility, because I do have this user base. And so being able to really give that flexibility so that you can compensate. The other thing that we're able to do is, when we look at the entire application architecture, we can look for those compensating controls to say, hey, I recognize that you are not doing, you are not enforcing a particular control at this point, but I see in the transactional chain that it's actually been enforced by this other gateway here that's sitting in front of your database. And so, so we recognize that that's happening, and so we don't have to report on the issue within the database itself.
Oh, wow. That's pretty cool.
And so that allows us to really kind of look at the architecture and make sure, once again, there may be needs for a control to be met at a certain point in the architecture, but if there's a mitigating design in place, right, we can recognize that and recognize that, okay, given this mitigating design, the risk is actually significantly lower and it doesn't get rated as high.
People are developing their infrastructures, codes, and they're committing it to a repository. And is at that point where you guys then pick it up and take a look at it and then report on it?
So from an integration point, as early as when you're writing this locally, you can use our CLI to scan that code. The second you integrate, you commit that code to the code repository, we are picking that triggers our platform. We'll pick up that code, we'll build a model of the solution architecture that code represents. We'll apply our blueprints to it, assess it against those blueprints, and identify where the gaps are. Chris, one thing that we didn't talk about is, once we identify the gaps, right, a big challenge that we're trying to solve here is, how do we incentivize this developer to then go the last mile and actually fix these issues? There's a lot of security tools in the industry today. We're all identifying issues that come back to the developer, and now the developer has this massive backlog of things that they need to address. And so part of our strategy to incentivize that developer is, we want to fit into their workflows. And once we identify an issue, the advantage of infrastructure as code is that it's declarative. So what we will do is, taking advantage of that fact, we will actually create pull requests within that developer's workflow. So if you're familiar with GitOps flows, a pull request is just a change request. It's something that developers are really familiar with. Like if another developer wanted to, make a code change to fix a bug, right? They would create a PR on a specific branch of code that developer is working on. And so we can do the same thing. We can create that pull request of, hey, here's the changes we recommend to make sure that you're doing data at rest encryption properly. And as a developer, if I agree conceptually that this is a requirement I want to meet, that I do want to be high trust compliant, or I do want to be PCI compliant, and I agree that this requirement matters, then, and I agree with the changes, I agree with how I am meeting this requirement, then I can, with the click of a button, accept those changes. And what Oak9 was able to do is really transform that application architecture through automation before it ever got deployed, right? And made sure that that specific requirement was met.
That's a great way to, solve for the problem rather than having to, hunt it down on the web and copy and paste it from somewhere else. You can just insert it directly, right?
Yeah. Well, Chris, one of the things also is our goal has always been to stay out of the developer's way.
Yeah.
Right. We know, like Aakash mentioned, there's hundreds of security tools that will tell you that you have a problem. Great. Right. Now that you have a problem, how am I going to fix it? Has been the biggest conundrum out there. And what we've purposely done is with all of our different integrations and whatnot, we allow developers to make those changes in their existing workflows versus having to come back into the Oak9 platform to do any changes or go back into somewhere else. They can just stay within their existing workflows and continue to develop, and they keep that speed, right? Which security usually will slow down just to make sure that everything is compliant and secure, right? So
to get back to sort of your earlier objectives of, the problem you were trying to solve here, right? I mean, I got to imagine that, there's a moment when you first deploy this that, security and the development teams have to kind of come together and say, this is the list of stuff that we're going to focus on and deal with. This is our compliance standards. This is the regulatory things that we have to meet. Security then can be, comfortable with that. And then rather than having to loop back to security all the time to, validate everything that's going on, they get to a level where they're comfortable with the devs sort of deploying code in a way that is consistent with what their security requirements are, right?
Yeah, we have an overall tracking dashboard too. So if a CISO wants to take a look at how secure all their applications are, how they're being deployed, et cetera, you can just see that off the dashboard, right? So the security organizations don't need to go into the code to truly understand what's going on. We've made it very, very simple, so organizations have a higher level of being able to look at it.
Well, and C-level loves dashboards, so I'm sure
yes.
Sure.
And pretty colored.
pretty colored dashboards. You'd be surprised how many products are sold on that, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And Chris, right? It's really about agreeing on, hey, these are the best practices we want to follow, right? These are the design patterns that we want to see in these applications from a security standpoint. And once dev teams and security teams agree, right, then it's really, about leveraging a platform like ours to then find use cases as products are being shipped through their pipelines to say, hey, here's a use case where this design pattern should be followed, right? Let's make sure that it is the case. And if it's not, right, can we impact this application architecture to make sure that it is following that design pattern? And once these kind of guardrails are established, then developers can move at the speed that they want. Security teams don't need to be IAC experts and dive into the code to make sure that things are actually being done properly. And so, both parties are able to move with velocity, and security on the other hand, right, instead of being bogged down by looking at issues in code, they can really focus more strategically on what are the design patterns that we should be following, right? Like, what are the best practices that we want to adopt within this organization?
Aakash and Raj, you guys both being from Chicago and starting this company in Chicago, obviously Chris and I are rooting for you. We're big fans of the Chi-Town. But curious, what has that experience been like to be a startup, getting Silicon Valley venture money from a great VC? You guys have a lot of good things going for you, but like what makes it more special that since it's from Chicago?
I grew up outside of Chicago in DeKalb and have been here my entire life, right? So undergrad at U of I, grad school at Northwestern. And, when the three of us were forming this company, one of the key things that we wanted to do was really make an impact in the Chicago market. And our logic behind that is because, you always hear about all these great companies coming out of the Valley, coming out of the East Coast, et cetera. And, what we've all been hell bent on is really making something special in Chicago. I will tell you, we started our company in 2020 and went through the whole VC round during that time. And I got to tell you, we start the company, pandemic hits, no VCs ever met us. We're three brand new founders, right? And so everything's over Zoom. So it was a little bit chaotic. We sometimes questioned, what are we doing? We actually had many VCs say, hey, if you move out to the Bay Area, we'll give you financing, and we held to our roots, right? I mean, we feel very strongly that Chicago can be an amazing hub. We built an organization of 40 plus people in Chicago. We just got a really nice office space off of Michigan Avenue, right? We're very pro Chicago, right? Actually one of our big team outings that we had this past summer was Cubs Rooftop, which was a total hit with the team, but, and that's how passionate we are, right? So, for us, building a company in Chicago is extremely special. And it's also the people in Chicago, because there's a huge tech talent pool in Chicago that sometimes gets overlooked. I mean, you look at all the universities that we have just within even from my house, you have DePaul, UIC, U of Chicago, Northwestern, and then, the amazing College of University of Illinois, right? We have all these great universities, and it sometimes is overlooked, right? And what we've all focused on, and Aakash is a U of I grad as well, one thing that we've focused in on is making this Chicago our home base and to really keep growing it from here.
Man, I just got goosebumps, man, with all that Chicago talk. That was awesome. That was amazing. To kind of ducktail on that one too, you guys got a lot of good mojo going on, which is great. I've noticed just from the things I'm seeing in your social media and LinkedIn stuff, I see that you're trying to do some things different in terms of recruiting. You're trying to make it a special place to work in general. Can you talk a little bit about what are the things that you're doing to kind of, make it appealing for some, great developer, great technical guy that's in Chicago, guy, gal, whomever? What are you doing to make it special?
Table stakes for building a software company is the development and security engineers. They have to be very passionate about what they're building. They have to also be challenged by what they're building, because otherwise, you could go to any Joe Schmo company and just do a 9-to-5 job. And that's not what we recruit for. We recruit for individuals that are extremely passionate and understand the space and want to build an amazing company. That's number one. Number two is every Thursday we offer up free food and beer. So that's amazing for employer attainment, because, what it does is we built a very close knit family type of culture within Oak9 where, people are looking out for each other. People are growing together, and we all understand that we're building something very, very big, right? And our goal, I even tell anyone that's coming into the company is, my ideal goal would be 5 years from now, I'm helping fund your startup that you're going to build, right? And that's, I think, for myself, Aakash, we felt that from the very beginning. We've hired some of the most talented folks. Sometimes our interview process is a little bit longer than people would like, right? But we always want to make sure it's the right cultural fit for the organization. And then if they have the smarts, the cultural fit, everything else is very easy because everyone really gets along with each other and enjoys, we work hard and play hard together.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, culture, being around in technology for as long as I have. Before I thought culture was like an excuse for not having great sales, we don't have a great sales, but we have a great culture, But what I realized, I was totally wrong on that, by the way, is that the culture is it's such a powerful thing. It's almost like your differentiator sometimes, but it's so hard to do. It's so hard to keep that culture and foster that culture, So I think everything you just said there, from what Chris and I have seen from so many startups, the ones that don't focus on their people, that don't focus on taking care of the first 50, 60, 80, 100, right? Once those first ones feel so close to your company, it's amazing. These cultures stick around even when the company's 1,000 people, because that core is so strong. So I applaud you because more people need to think like that, honestly.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's been one of our core areas that we as a founding team always focusing on, right? Is making sure that there's no hierarchy in the organization, right? Where what you see is what you get with all of us, right? The good, bad, and the ugly, right? But at the same time, we truly do, and we value our people. I don't think any company has value without having like very strong individuals underneath them, and that's what we built is like an amazing group of individuals.
And I got to imagine, there's advantages. Certainly there's a struggle in Chicago because you're not, in the middle of all the, Silicon Valley money and things like that. And you're not in the middle of the Silicon Valley talent pool. But on the other hand, you're also not in the middle of all that Silicon Valley money, and you're not in that, like super competitive, weird talent pool that's out there too. So, I mean, it's a little bit of give and pull, and, like for the right kind of company, I got to imagine, like being out of the chaos of the Valley, could really bring some advantages too, right?
Chaos is not good for a startup, right? So we try to avoid chaos. But no, I mean, it goes back to, and by the way, we do have employees in California, sure, in Austin, in Colorado, right? So we have some folks that are remote, but in general, right, staying away from the chaos, but also like there's a lot more noise there as well, right? Where here we can just build and focus on something that that we know is a huge problem in the market, and just stay focused on that versus getting sidetracked with all the additional noise that's going on in the market.
Yeah. I think the other thing is on the talent front. I mean, we're so centrally located, right? Like we have all these amazing Big Ten schools. We have just some awesome programs here in the Midwest. And being able to, just find talent here is so different, right, than the East Coast and the West Coast.
Yeah.
We have just a lot of folks that grew up in the Midwest, right, that want to stay in the Midwest, that want to keep their roots here, right? And having kind of deep tech companies that are really focused on solving hard problems is just exciting to them. And that's who we cater to.
Well, it sounds like a great opportunity, to just have your cake and eat it too, kind of live the Midwestern sort of chill life and do cool stuff.
Except for the winter time.
Except in the wintertime.
Except for the winter.
It does suck. It does suck.
This is actually the truth, right? Like, so I've run in my past, North America teams, global teams, et cetera, right? One thing I have realized is, folks in the Midwest actually do work harder because the weather's so crappy outside most of the time.
Got nothing else to do.
Exactly. Like Chris and I were talking earlier, and we're saying, we haven't even been outside today, and it's almost 70 degrees, which is amazing for Chicago, right? But like in general, like if you also think about this, and this is for all the other Chicago entrepreneurs out there, if you think about this, the talent here is going to work even harder because there's not much out. No one's going to go outside in -4 below temperature just to go for a walk or hang out. Like you're kind of forced to.
Yeah, you
work.
can't go to the ocean and then go skiing in the same day. So there's that too.
Exactly.
But also, man, I lived in the Valley for 4 years, and I will tell you it was too much. It was too much technology for me. From being a Midwest boy and being out there, I was a fish out of water because everyone was talking about things that I didn't really understand, like surfing and just, they're all about tech. They're all about money because they need the money because to live there, you have to make money. If you want to live in the Valley, you got to make money, right? So I came over here and it's like it's a completely different culture, right? It's like when I talk about work with some of my friends, they're like, dude, stop talking about work, but I can't stop doing that.
That's a Midwest thing.
Yeah. Well,
I live in 2 blocks away from your co-founders. We're all in the same neighborhood, so we can't avoid work regardless, right? The moment you step outside,
that must be a weird block party.
When we need to talk work, I know where to find him.
I know where you live.
Yeah.
Oh, they do. You started off at the beginning about how they recruited me. They're right at my door. No joke. Are you home, by the way? We're going to stop by real fast. Okay.
But hey, that's how it works, man. Like to create things, manufacture situations, companies, technology, whatever that's what it takes. You got to surround yourself with people. And it sounds like you guys have done such a great job. And I can tell with your humility with both of you is that you're really in it for the mission and not for yourself, and I think that is really, really, really important because we all have seen those founders that it's all about, them and how great they look, not how great the company is.
I mean, don't get me wrong, my looks are pretty decent, but no, I mean, all three of us are on a mission to really, really change the industry, because we have something and we see this massive problem. And everyone's just laser focused on solving. It's not just the founders; it's the entire organization. Everyone sees, like, what we're working on and how we're making this change and this shift in the marketplace, and that's what gets everyone super jazzed.
Well, on that mission front, what's next for Oak9?
I'll tell you from a company standpoint. I don't know if Aakash wants to go too deep on the product standpoint, but I will tell you, just from a high level, next quarter is going to be a big quarter for us, because we're launching our freemium version. As Aakash talked about security as code, we're going to allow, we're going to open up our security as code and make it open source. So what that'll allow, teams to do is actually contribute to the repository and build their own blueprints,
cool.
Which is going to be very exciting. Overall, as a company from Oak9, we continue to grow. We continue to hire talented individuals. And, our goal, just moving forward, I don't want to, look 5-10 years down the line. I get that asked that every single time, right? Our goal here is just to really continue to build on a really good, strong foundation that we've already built upon.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, it sounds like you guys have a really excellent start. And I'm excited to see where you guys go from here. You guys are an early stage company. I love to, talk to companies in an early stage, because it's cool to see, them grow and adapt and, change the market. And I'm excited to see where you guys go. Thanks so much for being on. I really appreciate you guys coming on.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Sandesh.
Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you like what you saw, please give us a like and think about subscribing. That subscription helps the channel a ton. And I'll see you in the next video.